So what we're going to do today is continue the lecture series, and today we'll talk about the development of Imperial China. Now, remember, just to kind of give you a crash course, obviously we haven't discussed China in quite some time, but just to kind of give you a recap. So again, you begin to see the formation of the Chinese state. Now, remember, officially there is no China yet. There are kingdoms within China. There are several kingdoms within China, but again, there is no actual China, especially not an empire, so to speak. Remember, the empire itself refers to the large cohesion of different ethnicities, linguistic groups, et cetera, that make up what is China today. That doesn't exist at this moment. Now, the period that we're talking about right now is around 500 BCE. Now, if you'll remember, the last major political entity in what is now China is the Zhao dynasty. Now, remember, the Zhao dynasty itself had faced a long and steady decline. All right, and in the middle of this decline, you essentially have these warlords, generals, these other political figures seizing territory for themselves. And while technically the Zhao dynasty still does exist, it exists in name only. The real power lies within these local, regional competing powers. And of course, we're referred to this era as the era of the warring states. And this is the period that we'll kind of pick up on at this point in time. Now, before we get into the political situation and the kind of conclusion, forgive me, of the warring states, let us talk about a couple of other kind of situations that form. Now, during this period of warring states, needless to say, there is a lot of self-reflection. How did China get like this? How did the Zhao dynasty collapse? And you know, why hasn't there been stability in China? Because remember, even with the Zhao before them, you have the different other political dynasties like the Jia dynasty, et cetera, et cetera. And so you begin to see people, or particularly philosophers and academics, kind of look back at history and kind of realize, or try to figure out what exactly went wrong. And you begin to see a lot of philosophies regarding the situation, not only what we got wrong, but what we can do to fix this. And so the example of this, and probably the most famous of these early political philosophers, is that of Confucius. Now, Confucius himself was actually not a government bureaucrat. All right, he couldn't pass the exams to actually enter into government service, but nevertheless, his writings became incredibly influential. Now, his writings together are known as the Analects. All right, again, these are the series of writings that he'd done in the course of his life, and these Analects kind of describe his own political philosophies at this point in time. Now, basically, the focus of Confucius's philosophy, more than anything else, at the end of the day, is the idea of reciprocity. Now, what this basically means, I'm sure you all have heard of this before at one point or another, or in some form or another. Do unto others what you would have them do unto you. This is pretty much the philosophy behind this. Now, you have to understand that Confucius himself is incredibly hierarchical. In other words, he emphasizes the role of everyone. In other words, if you're a peasant, you do that role well. If you are a monarch, you do that role well. So while it's extremely hierarchical, it also makes sure that it emphasizes that every single role, from the king or ruler all the way down to the lowest peasant, knows their role. Now, this concept of reciprocity itself is focused around the idea that individuals should strive for the qualities of what he called Ren, which is kindness or humaneness towards others. So again, Ren is this idea of being kind and humane towards other. And in addition, also emphasizing the issue of Li. Li is the issue of, it translates into ritual, but it really is more or less the idea of basically appropriate behavior towards others. And what this obviously translates into is a concept of respect. Respect for those above you, respect for those around you, respect for those who have come before you. In other words, the idea of ancestor worship in a sense. Now, Confucius, in regard to actual governance, like in other words, how does this tie into government? Well, the idea behind this is the idea that the government itself should be led by what he referred to as the Junshi. this here, Junzi. This Junshi is this idea of it literally translates into a superior man. Now, what this means is that he emphasized the importance of the bureaucracy. He emphasized the importance of a government that serves the people. Now, it's not just, you know, a well-trained and well-educated tax collector or a fair and just police officer. Now, you know, it's not enough that you just know your job. But remember, one of the big issues that the Zhao had, even in its early age, is abhorrent corruption, just everywhere. And so, what's the point of having an educated tax collector if he's just going to steal half of what he collects, right? And so, he emphasizes that it's not just enough that an individual knows their job, but also that they are ethical about it, right? And so this is what the concept of the Junshi is an individual who knows, a bureaucrat who not only is competent at their job, but also is also highly ethical as well. And so he also believed that these Junshi are not just effective bureaucrats, that they can actually be engines of change, of social change. In other words, that people look up to these bureaucrats. People look up to these individuals, almost like people look up to celebrities today. Kind of ironic, but nevertheless, people look up to them. And if these people act in a righteous and fair and benevolent manner, then people try to mimic that. In other words, people try to mimic or copy what they see their idols doing. And so if we do this, then we encourage people to behave, act righteously, and overall improve society. So it's basically just different examples of different examples of these bureaucrats. Remember, when you're talking about bureaucrats, you're talking about everyone from a person who collects taxes to a person who writes tickets for speeding. These are all members of a government bureaucracy. And so this is the foundation of Confucius's philosophy, the idea behind essentially good governance in the form of ethics and morals, and that these scholar bureaucrats, these individuals who are well educated, right, not just in whatever profession they choose, but also in ethics, right, would be the foundation of a government moving forward. And so now, when Confucius dies in 479 CE, his ideas are kind of start floating around to become very popular. We also begin to see other individuals kind of take those ideas and alter them on their own. Now, what I mean by this is that, for example, one of his later on students, one of his, obviously a century later, but nevertheless, one of his disciples in the future, a man named Mencius, essentially kind of takes his ideas and emphasizes the idea of righteousness. Now, what this essentially refers to is that this idea of governance, right, should be held by the idea of righteousness. In other words, he emphasized, now Confucius did this as well, but Mencius kind of really takes this further, where he basically says the idea that society must be bound by the idea of class structure. In other words, that everyone has to recognize their role and everyone has to be content with it. In other words, that essentially class structures must remain at least somewhat frozen in order for society to work. Now, it doesn't mean that social mobility doesn't happen. In other words, can a peasant become a noble? Kind of, but at the same time, having too much of this desire to move upward can be dangerous, can be counterproductive. And so Mencius himself argues the idea that there has to be a sense of complacency. Now, another one of Confucius's later disciples was Junshi. Now, when we talk about the differences between Junshi and Mencius, let's kind of focus here on what they believe the idea of humanity is. Now, Mencius himself actually believes the idea that people are born inherently good, that it is bad governance in the form of high taxes, in the form of oppression, that turn people bad, and even neglect for that matter. Zun Shi, on the other hand, from 310 to 219 BCE, is of a different belief. He believes in the idea of that people are born in not necessarily inherently, bad or evil. They're born inherently selfish, and that ethics or living in just simply living in society must be instilled in them. So I'm going to ask you all, and again, there is no wrong answer in this, but I'm just curious. I always ask my classes, do you believe that people are born inherently good and are somehow turned bad for one or another, or that people are born inherently selfish?
They were born good.
All right, Jonathan. So if you would just please tell me why you believe that. So one of the things I find fascinating is when children reach that particular period of, and Hector, you kind of touch on it now, when children reach the terrible two phase. Does anyone have any children, or anyone going through that right now? Going through a child is going through the terrible twos? Yeah. So clearly, what I'm referring to here is that when the child reaches that terrible two phase, and one of the parts of this is the mind phase. You all familiar with the mind phase, where they see someone have something? It could be a TV remote or orange or whatever, and they want it. But it doesn't really matter. It's not the object that they matter. It's the fact that someone has it and they want it. Because there's been I've seen it all the time where kid goes up to someone and they have an apple in their hand, mine, and they start crying, they throw tantrums, and you just give it to them, and you grab something else, like it's a set of keys or whatever. But now they see that you have that, and inevitably they want that too. Point I'm trying to make with this is that in this many ways, Zun Si sees this as a continuation where people are born inherently like this, that they have to be that they have to be taught how to live in a society. They have to taught how to cooperate and how to do things like this. Okay, so now, needless to say, Mencius and Jushi have two different sides of the same coin. They both believe in Confucius' philosophies, but they have very different views of this. Remember, Mencius himself very much is the belief that people are born inherently good, and the best way to keep them good is through good governance. Right? Jushi, on the other hand, believes that these individuals are born inherently not necessarily evil, but inherently self-centered and self-interested, and must be taught how to live in a society. And the best way to do this is through Confucius methods. Okay, does that make sense? Everyone clear? So again, we're talking here not just about good governance, but about reforming society. All right, because again, without society, without a solid society that is instilled ethics and responsibility, you essentially have chaos. Okay, and governance doesn't even matter at that point in time. Now, Confucius is just one of three different political philosophies that formed during this period of time. All right, the other one, and the one that becomes most popular during this time, is that of legalism. Now, legalism was formulated by two individuals who were advisors to one of the warring states, Qin. Now, this word will become important very later. The QIN is pronounced Qin. So this Qin state, again, you have two advisors, Han Fei and Li Si, who advise the local warlord, the Qin warlord, and they emphasize more than anything else the importance of the state. In other words, they kind of take Zun Si's ideas and they kind of build on them. And what this means is that they believe that people are born inherently, again, self-interested and greedy, but right, it's not good governance. It is that is needed to change them. It is they need to be instilled in them. They need to be emphasized. Now, for example, going back to this issue of children, many parents believe that the only way to instill ethics and behavior is through, I guess, what you would call corporal punishment. In other words, what we used to call back in the day the nalgada, right? In other words, the best way to teach a child not to violate certain social norms and rules is through the use of things like spanking. Right now, in many ways, legalism is very much like this. In other words, that people need to be drilled to follow certain ethical guidelines and issues. Right. In other words, so again, they believe that order in a state, they claim, can be implemented only through the institution of strict, detailed, and explicit laws diligently enforced and imposed on all subjects without regard to rank or class. So again, the idea behind this is that you have to create a very, very hard-lined set of rules and guidelines, and any violation to this is incredibly, and very good, Jonathan, and this means that everyone has to follow the rules. From the lowest peasant to the highest noble, no one is exempt, and there are harsh punishments, right? For example, later on in legalist China, you essentially have harsh violations such as stealing being punished by death. Now, the important thing about this is that you emphasize the importance of the state. And when I talk about the state, I'm referring to the government, right? I'm referring to the actual, when we're talking about the state, we're referring to the actual government, the actual polity that is ruling. Right, so obviously here in the United States, when we talk about the state, we're referring to the state of Texas or the state of New Mexico. That's not what I'm referring to. When we talk about the state in historical terms, we're talking about the government, the actual country. Right. So in this case, since we're talking about the Qin government here, the Qin state, we're talking about the emphasis of legalism is that the health of the state equals the health of the people. If the state is okay, if the state is healthy, then the people are, by equivalence, healthy as well. Does that make sense? In other words, this is what legalism teaches. In other words, that the individual, even society, is not what's important. It is the health of the state. Does that make sense? Because again, the idea is that if the state is healthy, then everyone else is fine. Now, because of this, right, legalism emphasizes that things such as art or commerce, trade, things like these aren't really that important. The two most important ideas behind legalism is that agriculture and military service are the two highest priorities, quite frankly, the two only priorities of the state. Maintaining an agricultural surplus, making sure there's food on the table, and that there is armies on the ground, right? Boots on the ground, as they say. So these are the foundation, these are the kind of the main emphasis of the state, right, in this particular case in legalism, right? The agriculture and military service, everything else, right, trade, art, et cetera, those things are waste of time because they don't benefit either of these two things. Now, so legalism, like I said, will become important in just a bit, but let's go over to the third and last one, which is the emphasis on Taoism. Now, Taoism is kind of the parallel opposite to both of these ideas. Taoism kind of comes from, it's kind of considered to be a reaction to Confucius and legalism, because both of these, both Confucianism and legalism both emphasize, the society as a whole. The different idea in different ways, but nevertheless, it emphasizes society as a whole. And so in Taoism, it emphasizes the individual. In other words, so in order to kind of discuss how this works in the greater set of society, let us talk about the actual concept of Taoism. Um, Now, what this means is that, so for example, before we talk about Taoism, let's talk about the idea of the Tao itself. Now, the founder, main philosopher who created Taoism, Lao Tzu, kind of creates this idea that much like in Indian philosophy, in Indian theology, that we are surrounded, that we are bound. Every living thing is bound by an energy known as the Tao, and that the Tao flows in a particular way, like a river, so to speak. Now, this Tao, it's very subtle. No one can sense it, but it's always there. And even Lao Tzu himself talks about the idea of the Tao being everywhere and doing everything, yet doing nothing. Let's focus on that idea, on doing everything, yet doing nothing. What do you think this means? How is it possible that this energy that surrounds and binds everything does everything, yet doesn't do anything? In a sense, I mean, you're right in a sense, Jonathan, where this is what Lao Tzu will eventually come up with. But let's think of it this way. Um, let's say that you're on a beach and you see a boulder on the beach, and it's being, hit by wave after wave after wave. Now, um, yeah, in a sense, Jonathan. I mean, I'm sorry, Joseph. But let's say that again, you're on the beach and you see this massive boulder on the beach and it's being hit by waves, and you sit there for hours, even days, and you just watch these waves crash into the boulder, and nothing happens, right? Uh, for example, um, oh, well, let's say that, what happens after, let's say, 2 million years or 5 million years? What happens to that boulder? Very good, Jonathan. It will erode. So while it seemingly does nothing, it is doing everything. So think of the Tao like this. Now, as I mentioned before, according to Lao Tzu, the Tao flows in a particular direction. It flows like a river, right? And it is the goal of everyone, according to Taoism, that you go with the flow, essentially. And this is where the term actually comes from, believe it or not. The idea that the Tao, that the energy of the universe flows in a particular way, and that in order to attain success, happiness, just an overall good life, you must learn to go with this flow. I wouldn't necessarily say growth, but more stability. Because remember, when stability comes growth. So again, this energy flows in a particular way, and it is your responsibility to do that. When you don't do that, when you go against the grain, when you go against the flow, that's when things happen. That's when bad things happen. Everything from financial failure to war to famine. That's essentially the cause of this. And so the question becomes then, how do you actually do this? How do you actually go with the flow? And the answer to this actually comes from the issue of essentially self-reflection and self analysis. In other words, Lao Tzu teaches that that essentially you do this through meditation, through self-introspection, through isolation. In other words, you have to understand yourself in order to do this. Now, this is in direct conflict with both Confucianism and legalism. Remember, because both of these emphasize you have to connect with people. You have to work as a society. You have to work as one. Taoism teaches that that is the opposite of what's happening. In other words, Taoism is actually emphasizing that societal gathering, societal cooperation, societal interaction is actually going against the flow. In order to actually achieve one with the Tao, you must actually, again, retreat from people. Doesn't necessarily mean become a hermit and live on your own. It just essentially means that you have to find the time to, you have to avoid constant social interaction and have to take the time to self-meditate and and kind of self reflect. Now, eventually, now Taoism itself never becomes a major political theory, but it does maintain a lot of followers, right? It is a philosophy. And you do begin to see some, later on in Chinese history, you do begin to see some influence of Taoism within the government. Now, eventually, Laozi's teachings eventually form a text, what is known as the Tao Te Ching. So again, here at the bottom, the Tao Te Ching is what I'm referring to here. Now, excuse me. So the Tao Te Ching is again is kind of the text, the written word of Laozi, and eventually becomes an incredibly popular book. And like I said before, while it doesn't become a dominant political system, it nonetheless does have a lot of influence, right? In other words, the idea of by non-action, there is nothing that is not done. In other words, that is to say that the ruler literally does nothing, rather his role is to create the conditions that naturally lead to a society in which everyone spontaneously acts in accordance with the Tao. In other words, many scholars in the future begin emphasizing that the best course of action in many instances is to do nothing. All right, just to essentially let matters fall into their own, let matters fall, as they do, and eventually a solution will be found. And so, legalism, Taoism, and Confucianism, all major issues, all major political ideologies that formed during this period in time. Now, in regard to either of these, is there any questions? Correct. All right, so moving forward. By the way, the concept of a balance. Remember, I'm sure all of you have seen this yin and yang. This is actually comes from Taoism. The idea of finding balance. Remember, the idea isn't to overcome certain evils or whatever. It's essentially to maintain balance. Because remember, with balance, you're going with the flow of the Tao. Right. So this is where this yin and yang comes from. That you cannot be all good, or at least be all, that there has to be portions of both good, what is called light and dark, good and evil, in everything. Right. It's a very dualistic philosophy. So going back to the political situation in what is now China during this period of time. Again, if y'all remember, the last time that we left off on China, it is undergoing a major period of civil war known as the Warring States period. Now, originally, there were 8 competing states against each other, but eventually you begin to see this being narrowed down, and eventually there are 5. Now, I'm not going to get into the specifics of this, but I do want to emphasize on one, which is, of course, the victorious one, the state of Qin. Now, the Qin state, if you see here in far western China, actually itself is an incredibly, now it kind of considered to be an outsider because of its position. If you notice here, it's kind of in the frontier of what is considered to be actual China itself, here along the Yellow River. And actually, this worked to their benefit. Being out here by themselves, it allowed them to pretty much avoid the major conflicts of the other warring states, kind of let them kind of solidify their power, gain strength, and watch the others kind of tear each other apart. Now, where the Qin state actually begins to become more and more, let's say, effective is with the adoption of legalism. Now, legalism, needless to say, is an incredibly harsh political system, but it also is very effective in terms of war. Because remember, the two things that are absolutely necessary in war are food and soldiers. And legalism basically tends itself to that. And so, with this adoption of legalism, you essentially have the Qin state expanding its borders. If you see here, it begins by conquering the other major areas of the West here in 315, what is now northern China, Mongolia, well, parts of Mongolia, Tibet, and eventually it continues to expand westward, right? And not only does it basically unite much of the previous Zhao state, it also begins defeating the local nomads. The nomadic peoples around China had begun the process of actually, constantly invading and raiding Chinese cities and settlements, and you actually see them being defeated. Now, the one major one I want to focus on is the peoples known as the Zhongyu. Now, the Zhongyu, we believe, are, again, the same peoples who we refer to as the Huns, who later become the Mongols. All right, so again, they're still kind of present here in what is now northern Mongolia, and they launch constant raids into northern China until they are defeated by the Qin armies. Now, with the Qin being defeated, with the Qin uniting all of the known area of what is now China, you have an empire declared. You have the first emperor, Qin Shi Huangdi, declaring himself emperor in 221 CE and establishing the Qin dynasty. Now, this is an incredibly important period in Chinese history because, again, for the first time, you essentially have a empire being created where the majority of the Chinese speaking. Now, remember, when we're talking about the Chinese speaking, people referring to what is now considered to be Mandarin Chinese speaking peoples under the banner of one particular emperor. And so Qin Shi Huangdi becomes emperor in 221 BC. I'm sorry, 221 BCE. That's not supposed to be CE. Forgive me. This is supposed to be BCE, not CE. Now, the rule of the emperor himself, the rule of the Qin emperor, begins by massive restructuring and rebuilding programs. All right, now, the first thing is, needless to say, he begins the process of trying or attempting to build a massive wall in the northern border to keep these nomadic raiders out of Chinese territory, right? And so, during the reign of Qin Shi Huangdi, you begin to see the process of, again, building what will become the Great Wall of China. Now, in addition, you also begin to see the standardization of Chinese weights and measures, but also you begin to see the standardization of the Chinese script. Now, here in the southern region of China, there are different dialects, but one particular dialect there's one particular dialect of what we call a Chinese language that becomes incredibly popular during this period of time. Does anyone know what the other major Chinese dialect is aside from Mandarin? No, it is not Kung Fu. Anyone? Cantonese, all right, which is primarily spoken here in the southern regions in China. Now, these languages are relatively unintelligible with one another. Think of it this way. If you ever heard French, I mean, obviously French, for those of you who speak Spanish, it, you can pick up a word here or there, but for the most part, someone who speaks only Spanish cannot have a conversation with someone who speaks only French, right? And so think of it like that. And so, yeah, in a sense like that. And so despite the fact that you have these linguistic differences, the Chinese script, remember this large amount of Chinese characters that were developed a thousand years before, it begins the process of actually formulating a standard script. So in other words, the Chinese emperor, Qin Shi Huangdi, orders that all texts in China now use the same characters. And so while, yes, you do have linguistic differences between Cantonese, Mandarin, things like this, you do nonetheless have this emphasis of, again, standardization of script. Not just script, but weights, measures, et cetera, et cetera. Now, a pound in northern China is the same thing as a pound in southern China, and so on and so forth. One of the more interesting things about this is that even as soon as he became emperor, he begins ordering the construction of a massive tomb. Now, I'm sure all of you have seen pictures of the terracotta warriors here. This is the tomb of Qin Shi Huangdi, which was discovered in China in the 1970s. No one had really known where he was buried up until this point in time. Now, this is only one of a massive structure. I mean, this place is huge. There are literally tens of thousands of these terracotta soldiers. And what's fascinating, each one of them is unique to another. In other words, the faces, even if you notice here on the PowerPoint slide, there is not one face that looks exactly the same as the other one, right? Each has their unique facial features, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the interesting thing about the tomb is that it's actually never been opened. So yes, the area around it here has been uncovered, but the actual tomb where the body of Qin Shi Huangdi is believed to be buried, it's a building into itself, and it's never been really opened. And there's a couple of reasons for this. First of all, the Chinese method of burial itself is in other words, we are afraid that if we open it and expose it to oxygen, that much of the stuff that's in there will be destroyed. The other thing, and the other reason why, is because according to the records that we have, Qin Shi Huangdi was also buried with about 500 people alive. So he was buried with 500 servants to serve him in his next life. And so the Chinese government doesn't want the embarrassment of finding out that, yeah, the first sovereign emperor was actually buried with 500 people alive. And that kind of ties into the next thing I was going to emphasize, the issue of his brutality. And what I mean by this is that Qin Shi Huangdi himself, again, was a devout legalist. I mean, remember, this won him victory, and so why wouldn't he practice legalism? And so and he turned out to be incredibly cruel and harsh. Those who questioned his orders, those who had issues with his rule, were met with harsh justice. And I'll give you an example of this. So in order to build, so it's not just the Great Wall of China, but you have massive construction projects. You begin to see the construction of a canal that would link the Yellow River to the Yangtze River, which is hundreds of miles. You begin to see the rebuilding of walls and dams and government buildings, and all of this stuff, needless to say, takes a significant amount of time, effort, and money. And it's a drain on the Chinese economy. And so you have a large group of scholar bureaucrats going to the emperor and saying, with all due respect, you need to be careful. This is dangerous ground you're working on. You're draining the life out of China. And so the emperor, tells the scholars, thank you for your honesty. I'll seriously think about it, but I just want to thank you for being upfront with me. Why don't you come over to dinner later, and we'll have a banquet on your honor. All right, thank you. So yeah, they come back later on today, but later on that day, but instead of finding a banquet, they find soldiers who take all 400 of them and bury them alive. So this just goes to show you the cruelty of Xing Wangdi. Now, it is this cruelty, it is this overburdens by Xing Wangdi that eventually leads to the collapse of the Qin dynasty. All right, and it is no, but remember, yeah, because again, he believed in the idea that he was always right. Now, eventually, this, upon Shingwandi's death in 209, while you do have his grandson eventually becoming the emperor, his grandson does not have the willpower, the cruelty to build this empire. Remember, by the end of the Qin dynasty, by the end of Xing Huangdi's rule, you basically have this empire just being ruled by just his willpower, by his cruelty, by fear. This takes a very particular set of personality types that his grandson, sorry, did not have. And so eventually you have this particular dynasty collapsing in 206 CE. Now, this society quickly collapses, and you have again the same thing where after at the end of the Zhao period, you basically have the Zhao dynasty collapsing and fragmenting into different warring states. The same thing happens here, but this one's a lot faster, right? In other words, in a period of about 4 years, one of the generals of the previous Qin dynasty, Liu Bang, is able to quickly unite most of the Qin Empire and establish a new dynasty, which is known as the Han. So again, the Chinese general Liu Bang is able to essentially unite much of the Chinese, much of what is now China, and you eventually have the creation of the Han Dynasty. Now, interesting enough, Liu Bang's claim to the throne is not very legitimate, right? Because Liu Bang is not of noble birth. He was actually the son of a peasant who basically just joined the Chinese military and rose to the ranks to become one of the top generals. And so all of a sudden now there's a question of, is he considered a legitimate ruler? But nevertheless, despite these questions of legitimacy, you have a dynasty here that exists for the next 400 years. So upon the Han dynasty being created, you have Liu Bang and his successors attempting to rectify the issues of the past. And they do this through a couple of means, in a couple of ways. First of all, you have the expansion of the Chinese bureaucracy. Again, the attempt to essentially try to expand the number of bureaucrats serving the Chinese government to basically make the government more efficient. The idea behind this is that with more government issues or more government support, they could be more responsive to the people, the needs of the people of China. In addition, you also have the establishment of what we call commanderies. What this means is that the Qin dynasty, everything was incredibly top heavy. And what I mean by this is that everything was centralized around the emperor. This makes decision-making incredibly difficult because all of a sudden, all the burden of ruling and administering this large empire falls basically on one individual. And so needless to say, this caused severe inefficiencies. So what the Han do is basically kind of divide the empire into what we call commanderies. And so while he kept the Qin power structure intact, he also essentially kind of gave more authority to the local rulers. Now, this isn't just about administering, this is also about defense, right? Because each one of these commanderies is also a military general. So in case there's an invasion or rebellion breaks out, they're responsible for maintaining the control or maintaining the defense of their particular region. And so again, these commanderies are local, regional, not just administrative districts, but also defense district as well. Now, kind of the most important and the fastest reform that was undertaken by the Han during this period of time is replacing legalism with Confucianism. Again, As far as Liu Bang and everyone around was concerned, the main reason for the collapse of the previous Qin dynasty was the brutality of legalism. All right, in other words, the outright brutality, anger, just overall overbearing governance of legalism was done. And remember, keep in mind that legalism is not, it has been proven to be successful. It won Qin Shi Huangdi his war, but remember, this legalism could be considered one of those wartime governments. In other words, yes, it is very effective in a war, but when you're not at war, it's very brutal. And so legalism was replaced by Confucianism very early on during this period in time. Now, at probably the height of the Han period of Chinese history is that of during the period of Han Wudi. Wu Di was the emperor from 140 to 87 CE. And while, yes, he does have a complex, his rule is is faced with difficulties and troubles, he nonetheless kind of handled it relatively well. Now, one of the big issues of China at this period in time is as it expands, it begins incorporating non-Han people. Now remember, the dominant ethnic group in this period, this area of central China, is what is considered to be Han. Right? This is the name of the ethnic group, the majority of people who make up what is now China. But keep in mind that not every person in this area is Han. They may be Asiatic, but they're not ethnically Han Chinese. And so as the empire expands, you begin to see, again, the incorporation of non-Han peoples. Now, Wu Di and his advisors began the policy of essentially encouraging the Han people to colonize these new territories. So these areas out here in the west, in the south, in the north, all of a sudden they're encouraged, they're encouraging people to move. We'll give you free land, we'll give you a break on taxes, just go and move in these places. Now, the whole hope of this is not only to expand Han influence, but also eventually what we call Sinify, or the process of Sinification. In other words, make them Chinese. By moving Han peoples into these areas where there are non-Han peoples, the hope is that they would teach them everything from speaking the Mandarin language to basically becoming Chinese. So this is a pretty standard policy, mind you, of many imperial powers, is a process of trying to turn ethnic and racial minorities into the dominant culture. Right? The Russians will do this later on. The United States, even in Mexico, for example, you have this issue of trying to acclimate an ethnic, linguistic, religious, cultural minority into the greater sense. All right, again, to develop cultural unity. Why? Because more of a unity, less problems, according to the mindset. So again, during this period of Wu Di, you begin to see again this kind of the golden era of Chinese expansion and power. But you do have this period of turbulence between what we'll say 8 CE and 24 CE. Now, what this means during this period in time, there is a relative of the royal family by the name of Wang Mang. Wang Mang was, now at the time, the Han Emperor was a small boy. I believe he was like 4 or 5 years old. And so there was basically a sense of instability at this period of time. Wang Mang was a relative, a close relative, who became the chief minister, but eventually decides that being the minister to a boy is not enough. And so he basically overthrows the boy and establishes his own dynasty known as the Jin dynasty. Now, the Jin dynasty itself is marked with immediate problems. First of all, Wang Mang had absolutely no power, no legitimate claim to the throne. And so much of his, again, many people began to kind of question and even rebel against this new dynasty. Now, Wang Man attempted to win the support of the people by essentially basically what we call land redistribution. In other words, basically taking land away from the nobles who didn't like them and giving it to the poor, kind of like a Robin, trying to turn himself into a Robin Hood type of situation. Now, this didn't work. As a matter of fact, his reforms, trying to win the support of the people, actually began to lead into rebellions. A particular secret society of Taoists, by the title of the Red Eyebrows, actually began rebelling against him, and eventually attacked the capital here of Chang'an, killed Wang Man, and eventually reestablished the Han Dynasty. Now, because the capital of Chang'an was basically burnt to the ground, you have the capital moving upriver to Luoyang. All right, so again, Wang Man attempted to establish a new dynasty, and in order to do this, in order to win the support of the people, he attempted various reforms, including redistribution of land from the wealthy to the poor. But eventually, his reforms upset many, many others, and eventually, a society called the Red Eyebrows will eventually rise up, kill Wang Man, burn down the capital, and eventually you have the Han Dynasty being recreated or being reestablished. Now, it's important to note that the Han Dynasty never recovers from this. In other words, yes, while they are reinstalled in power, it is never they're never the same this political situation that they were in. All right, yes, they survived, but they're basically on life support for the next 200 years. All right, and so one of the big issues, one of the big reasons why you have the collapse of the Han, not just because of the use of now corvée labor. We've talked about corvée labor before. Does anyone remember what this means? Kind of. Remember, corvée labor basically means it's a form of taxation you pay in labor. In other words, if you're a peasant, you're expected to basically work for the government for X amount of months, right? Basically doing everything from digging canals to building bridges. This is how you pay your taxes. Now, corvée labor has been used in China since the beginning of the Xie dynasty, but as time progressed, the Han, becoming more and more desperate, have now usually most governments at this point in time have been able to kind of use corvée labor on off months. In other words, from the time that the Chinese farmers sow their fields to the time that they harvest, those months are usually the time that you get recruited to do whatever it is that the government wants. But as things have become more desperate, all right, they've increased the number of months that peasants are required to work this corvée labor. And so with less time to work on their fields, you begin to see issues with food production. All of a sudden now you begin to see these issues of disruption in food production because the peasants are working on government projects. Not only that, but not only do you have to pay this, not only have to do this corvée labor, but you still have to pay taxes. And the Han period begins to again increase taxes during this period in time. All right. Now the problem is that it's very much like what happens in Rome at this period in time, where with peasants unable to pay this egregious amount of taxation, you begin to see an issue of basically land seizures, where if you can't pay your taxes, and the government seizes your farm, and then a local wealthy landowner will gobble it up. And so that income disparity, that gap between the rich and the poor, continues to expand, and quite frankly, it explodes. Remember, As I keep telling you in this class, income inequality, you can only have so much before it tips over, before a boiling point is reached. And in this case, that boiling point has reached. Right now, so the Chinese peasants begin clamoring for more and more reform. We need the government to step in and stop the seizure of small lands or small farms by the wealthy landowners of China. Right? And when the government was unable to do this, it's not that they were unwilling, they just simply did not have the political structure to do this. You begin to see peasant revolts. And the largest and most influential of these are the Yellow Turban Rebellion. Now, the Yellow Turban Rebellion, again, this rebellion of peasants angry over lack of land reform, they begin to basically rebel in China. Now, it is a mass rebellion. It is eventually put down, but the Chinese, the Han Dynasty never recovers. So a few years after the rebellion puts down, the last Han emperor is murdered, and you basically have, once again, China fracturing into different kingdoms, and you basically have, again, once again, civil war. Now, during this period of time, the various states, the various areas that form during this period in time attempt to kind of resolve the issue of land reform on their own. And they do this by implementing what is known as the equal field system. Now, if y'all remember, when Wang Man attempted to become emperor, he basically began the process of redistributing land from the wealthy to the poor. Now, he did it in a very, very horrible manner, but the idea of land redistribution is not that unpopular in China. It's actually really popular, right? And so these different kingdoms that have now developed in China attempt to pretty much do the exact same thing, only much more nuanced, much more careful. And the process by this is known as the equal field system. Now, what this is basically it establishes a cap on the amount of land an individual can own. Now, it's not to say that the nobles, the wealthy people cannot own large tracts of land. They can, but it's just capped. After it reaches a certain amount, the government seizes that particular land, the excess land, and they give it to people based on need. Right? And how does the government judge if a people is based, how does the government judge who's needy and who's not? By the size of the family. If a large family needs land, they're put at the top of the list. And by large, I mean 10 or more. So this equal field system was an attempt to redistribute land based on need. Right? Again, by seizing land from the wealthy, who, again, based on whatever government is at the time, once they go over a particular cap. Now, this period of civil war between the Han, after the Han Dynasty collapses, lasts for about 350 years until one of the competing states, the Sui, led by the Emperor Yang Jian, is able to reunite much, not all, but much of China. So the Sui dynasty itself begins the process of trying to rebuild and reunify China after 300 years of civil war. And for the most part, it is somewhat successful. For example, right, you have the completion of the Grand Canal. Remember this large canal that connects the Yangtze and the Yellow Rivers here in the north and the south. You have its construction finally completed. And you have the reestablishment of somewhat a sense of stability. Now, excuse me. So despite and in addition, you also have the kind of the resurgence, or at least the establishment of Buddhism. Now, by this period in time, Buddhism had already become popular in China with the peasantry, but you begin to see it become the dominant religious, the religious faction within China at this period in time, right? And so while the government itself doesn't officially adopt Buddhism, by this period in time, the majority of the Chinese are actually all some form or another Buddhist. Now, so while you do have a period of stability, you do nonetheless have the Sui dynasty collapsing relatively quickly. In 618 CE, the 16-year-old emperor was murdered, and you have a new dynasty quickly arising after that, known as the Tang in 627 CE. So despite the initial success of the Sui dynasty, political intrigue and instability causes its collapse in the establishment of a new dynasty, which we'll talk about later on in the semester. Now, very quickly, I do want to kind of go over a couple of aspects as quickly as possible. First of all, I want to talk about the process of state monopolization. Now, can anyone tell me what a monopoly is? And no, it is not the board game. What is a monopoly? I didn't ask for examples of monopoly. I said, I mean, you're not wrong, Jonathan, but Needham, you're right. It's not necessarily a company. It's any particular type of entity that has control of a particular market. For example, ever since the Zhao dynasty, even maybe before that, you have the state, the government controlling certain industries, right? Particularly in this case, iron and salt. Now, these two items, again, as I mentioned before, are basically controlled by the government. So all iron and salt mines in China are actually run and controlled by the government. Now, what this means by this, or what I mean by this, I should say, is the idea that both of these things are controlled by the government. They control not only how much is produced, but what the price is. Now, these two things are controlled not only because they're constantly needed, and they're so, again, but also to ensure that they're always readily available, right? Salt in particular is incredibly important to everyday life, quite frankly. And so the government feels that it is under their control, that you basically have the best, let's call it the best method in order to get people these things. All right. And not only that, it also provides a good a source of revenue for the government. Right. So again, the on paper, the purpose of these state monopolies is to ensure that prices are kept low, that production is always steady, and that the state incurs a sense of revenue. Now, the majority of the large landowners in China at this period in time are not the nobility. The Chinese nobility by this point in time, the old school aristocracy, that's long gone. Right? The China's noble families really don't own a lot of land. Instead, the majority of the wealthy landowners are actually what we call the scholar gentry, the bureaucrats. Remember, they, especially those who serve the imperial system. Now, remember, there are three tiers when it comes to government service. At the bottom, there is the municipal servants. Now, these are government workers who, again, basically work on local levels. They may be police officers. They may work local government buildings. They're just, again, they're local. Think of them like city employees. Then there are the provincial. They are, again, the equivalent of state employees. They work in the higher offices of whatever province that they serve. All right, and again, then you finally have the imperial. The imperial bureaucracy is the elite of the elite. All right, they serve, again, they basically serve the imperial functions, and they basically are the thoughts, the ears, the eyes of the emperor. Right, and so it is the imperial bureaucrats that do have the possibility of accumulating a significant amount of wealth. And so the scholar gentry, again, it itself is incredibly it's incredibly influential, and they begin seizing more and more land for themselves. Now, this is the thing, is that in many instances, the highest landowners often have enough political influence to exempt themselves from taxes. So not only do the wealthiest landowners control these huge tracts of land, they also don't pay any taxes in it. So the burden of taxation falls on the small landowners. All right, and again, as unfair as that is, keep in mind that poor harvest or bad weather, particularly in the north, make the situation even worse for those already heavily taxed. So this is already, needless to say, a incredibly unfair system. And while you do have land reform productions, while you do have land reform initiatives, you nonetheless have these things are only temporary. For example, we were talking about the equal field system earlier, where you have land being redistributed to families. Well, the thing about it is that the government would just basically give them the land and say, okay, well, here, do whatever you want with it. The problem is that they usually, these peasants who have accumulated this land do not have any equipment. They don't have any equipment to work the land. They don't have any seeds to plant their crops. They're starting off with literally nothing. And so all of a sudden the local landowners, the wealthy landowners will come by and say, well, I can give you, I can loan you out money so you can buy all this stuff. I'll just charge you interest. But the problem is they charge some egregious thing like 50% interest, knowing that the farmers will not be able to pay this back. And they put up their land, this new acquired land, as their collateral. And so a farmer, loans out, borrows this money from this landowner at a high interest rate. They can't pay it back, and so they eventually end up losing that land anyway to these local landowners again. All right, and so this is where this usury comes from. This issue of usury, and we'll talk about later on, is the issue of charging interest on a loan. All right, and in many cases, in many areas, Europe, Central and South Asia, North Africa, usury is actually considered a crime, but nonetheless, it happens anyway. Now, despite these issues, you do have agricultural production increasing dramatically. And a lot of the reason why is because of the development of quick ripening rice. Right? Again, here in the South, now remember, in the North, it is not as tropical. It is nowhere near tropical. It is what we call temperate. It is often cold and many times of the year, and it's not suitable for rice production. But in the South, in the new regions of the South, you do have rice becoming the dominant crop. And again, through the use of genetic manipulation, you have rice being bred to ripen after 3 months, right? And so with this new technique of developing rice, you now have more and more food to grow around, which of course increases rice production. Now, with the stability of the imperial era, you essentially have the formation of new trade networks, to new contacts in what we now call Korea and Japan. We also begin to see, again, during the Han period, fairly constant contact between Han China and Rome, right? And this will continue on for quite some time, even after the collapse of both Han and Rome. And we'll talk more about the Silk Road as it develops. But again, remember, the Silk Road is not an actual road. It's not a literal road like I-10. It is a network of trading routes, both land and on sea, that connect east to west, north to south. And we'll talk more about it in detail as we go along. But other than that, I think we will stop there. All right.